Byron knew when he invited me to speak that he was inviting not only a Christian, but also a Christian contemplative and a mystic with strong wilderness inclinations. As I was beginning this talk on the topic of what do our particular faith traditions have to say, particularly about climate disruption and the call to action, I began thinking in terms of the broader Christian tradition, but as the further I went into it, the further I found my own commitment and passion really takes a strong mystical bend. So decided I'm just going to speak from that stance within the Christian tradition. Two concepts that are fundamental to our Christian experience of the Spirit. One is the concept of incarnation, that we believe this astounding, radical, really unbelievable, if you mean believing with the rational mind, that the infinite entered into human form, into human flesh, and one of the immediate consequences of that is that everything is sacred. That the source of life deigned to participate in this life in a finite way, to be contracted almost. Once again, it doesn't make any sense in logical terms, but from the infinite into the finite, there's an element of blessing in that. It's very profound, that informs any engagement with the natural world. And the second is Jesus' primary teaching and expression in his life was that of unconditional love. When we speak of our future, of our children, of any human life or of any life, the stance of mature Christianity is unconditional love, which means giving without counting the cost. It's the exact inverse of that capitalist goal of taking more and more and more and more. It really flips it on its head, as that ethic did in the ancient world that it came into. So that's all I'll say about the tradition as a whole. But coming into the mystical aspect, Karl Rahner, the great Catholic theologian, speaking in the 1980s at his last public address, said that the age is coming when we must all become mystics or become nothing at all. And I believe in saying that he was foretelling a time when a shift to unitive consciousness, or to transform consciousness, would be the only way for humanity to have the capacity to address the scale of problems present to us. And I personally believe that climate disruption is the mark that this time has come. We can no longer afford to persist in a divided, or you might even say sort of a fractured consciousness where my identity and well-being is seen as separate from yours and we're in competition. It never worked well, but the consequences have come to the point right now where I doubt that we're going to survive certainly another century with that as the dominant consciousness and the order of structure for human activity. So climate disruption is huge. It's a problem far greater in scale than anything we previously faced. As our friend Bill McKibben spoke earlier today, it's greater than any of our previous challenges. And I think if we take this seriously, it tears at the very heart of the technological, economic, social, intellectual foundations of our civilization. So the civilization we've created and the consciousness that created it are on a direct collision course with reality and the unwavering laws of the natural world. It's not working. It can't work. It was useful at a time. There was a necessary rising of that consciousness. But I think that time of useful service is done. And my Christian tradition has a name for this type of event, this type of time. It's called the apocalypse. Contrary to Hollywood images, the apocalypse is not about massive explosions and buildings falling upon one another. The word in Greek means the unveiling. It means revealing the reality that's been present, that's been hidden, that's been obscured from our vision, and now we see it the way it is. And what we're seeing the way it is that this level of consciousness, this level of awareness cannot work, and we need to change. One of our questions was of the continuity between past social movements and this current movement. And I'm actually going to argue that this movement is a fundamentally different nature. Those movements were important and they can inform this, because in the social primary issue was the inclusion of groups that had been disempowered or kept out to participate in the blessings of a system that we all agree was fundamentally working and worth keeping, that we were bringing in people that were left out of power into a structure that was going to produce good for all of us. So the effort was reformation. Now, I think climate disruption is calling us to transformation. That's different. Our political system, our economic system, our educational system, and our technologies do not deal with transformation. They're capable of mild reformation. And unfortunately, contemporary religion has rarely dealt with transformation. However, the enduring and authentic call of all true religion is to transformation, particularly transformation of consciousness. This is why it exists. So I think climate change, or climate disruption, and also economic collapse and the end of cheap natural resources, which come together to mark the end of the modern era as we know it, is actually an opportunity for religions and spiritualities to rediscover our original role as agents of human transformation. Particularly the transformation of human consciousness from egocentric to unitive states that are capable of taking the well-being of the entire planet as the baseline for action, not as a concept, but as a felt reality. In the Christian tradition, this is called divinization. Early in the church history, the Athanasius said it in the 4th century very clearly as the whole purpose of Christianity. He said that God became human so that humans might become divine. And he means sharing this divine life, this divine light, and this consciousness, and living it out on earth. It's the very heart of this tradition, and I believe of all authentic religion. Expressed in different forms in other traditions that time doesn't allow me to go into right now.
The other thing that's very hopeful to me about climate change is that that's been true for 20 centuries in the Christian tradition and perhaps far longer in human consciousness, this call to transformation. We have saints, we have mystics, we have seers, we have people that have embodied that as individuals, but we have yet to embody that as a collective, as a whole. And in past centuries, I think there was a certain amount of peace that came with that. There's a certain sense that there's a precious few that might attend to this higher state, and it's enough for the rest of us to go on looking to them as examples and models, or perhaps even to pray to them. I think climate disruption and the massive consequences for human well-being and for the well-being of the earth mean that we now have a time limit. So it's time to grow up, because we don't have forever to move collectively to a deeper level of consciousness and awareness. We have a time limit. As Bill McKibben said earlier today, with the climate, we have a time limit, and I would say that there's a corresponding inner urgency and necessity to take seriously the very heart of our spiritual traditions, to transform not only the outward world, but also our inner landscape. So I think the call from my tradition, and I think from religion as a whole, is to this shift, these shifts of consciousness and inner transformation that can parallel and support and grant stability to any sort of political reform and change. This is the one thing that religion can do that good ethical people coming from for example, a scientific background don't have the same language or tools or equipment from. This is what the richness that our religions can bring to the table. You don't need religion to be ethical, but in terms of systems of human transformation, there's something unique that's being offered in our traditions. So in my tradition, I see two particular examples of that. There's many. One is the great shift from materialism to a spiritual-based understanding of human well-being and particularly growth. From this perspective, each one of us has a God-sized hole in our heart, and it's a space that can only be filled by intimacy with the infinite. Augustine of Hippo said that Our hearts are restless, O God, and they remain forever restless until they rest in you. And what I take from this is that in a materialist culture, we're taught to try to fill this infinite hole with stuff. And it never works, and it can't work, because the hole is infinite. It wants to be filled by the infinite. And so all the efforts just leave us wanting more and more and more. I'm reminded of the Buddhist concept of the hungry ghost. As a culture, we become hungry ghosts. So, again, in Bill's book, when he talks about his book, Deep Economy, he mentions that statistically speaking, we stopped becoming happier as we increased our material affluence somewhere in the 1950s. And after that, there's been an inverse relationship. So I would say that from a spiritual perspective, unlimited growth is possible, and we need to recognize this, because we can't just say, let's restrain ourselves, let's stop growing, let's stop expanding. But if a shift can be made, so we begin to value growth primarily in the realm of the spirit, then both unlimited growth and a great simplicity of material life are possible simultaneously. It's one of the promises of a spiritual tradition. To be more specific, when in high contemplation we experience our consciousness as larger than that of the planet, which is possible and in fact normal at certain states, at certain levels of development, the need for material possessions becomes narrowed down to the simple necessities of the survival of our physical body. Enough food, a roof over our houses, and all of our interest and value goes into things of the spirit. I think that's what we're made for. I think that's how human beings operate well. Imagine if that became our human norm. And I think that is the invitation of our traditions. Secondly, when we open fully to our spirits, I believe there's a parallel between the deep soul of a human being and the deep soul of the natural world. In my work as a wilderness guide and wilderness retreat leader, I see this all the time. When a person goes more deeply into their inward self, there's a deepening awareness of the mystery and presence and beingness, as Mary Evelyn spoke of, that awe and wonder with the natural world, and correspondingly, or awe and wonder of the natural world leads to a deepening encounter with soul. In this, I find that there's a natural, organic shift to what I call the I-thou relationship with the natural world, that as we begin to experience other living beings as being full of the same wonder and mystery and power as a human being and in fact as God, because they're radiating something of the divine presence. So magical things begin to happen when we shift into that state of awareness, when we're engaged with nature. Animals begin to pay attention to us as we begin to pay attention to them. People begin to have dreams of certain medicinal plants when they have a sickness, and the medicinal plant corresponds to their illness, even if they know nothing about herbology. One example. The world becomes re-enchanted. We lose the need to read about enchantment in The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, because we can go outside and find a pull or an attraction or something stirring in our heart when we walk by a great oak, and we can listen to it and we can hear something. It's experiences like this that I've had personally in many long years of solitude in wilderness environments, and also in being blessed to be with others and supporting others in encountering the natural world in a deeper way, that have led me to make sense of the tradition of Francis of Assisi, referring to all the different wild animals and plants as brother Wolfe and sister moon and sister river, and speaking of these with kinship terms. I think he really felt them as these living, vital others, and I do believe that is part of our inheritance. So I think this is what faith can offer to our climate discussion. It can offer a way to return to the deep center of our own being, and through that, a way of re-engaging with the natural world in a way that is vital and life-fulfilling, that makes the empty promises of this dying materialist system very easy, in fact, even joyful to let go of. May we do so swiftly.